Hey guys, it's Navinad, and I'm back with something that I'm actually excited to do. I'm doing a series on lines, and what I mean by lines is we're going to be talking about various parts of our range, different types of hands that we're going to play, and the things that we need to consider in order to play them profitably, or as best we can. Um, how are we going to play nutty value hands, or how are we going to play draws, how are we going to play showdown value or bluff catchers, things like that. But for part one, in understanding line creation or lines, I thought it would be fun to just hop right into everybody's favorite subject, how to play nutted value hands. I mean, this is kind of fun to think about because it's really one of the most satisfying things in poker, right? Is you're playing at the local cash game, at the 2-5 game at the Hollywood Casino in Toledo, or the Shoe in Cleveland here, and you call an open raise, and you're 200 big blinds deep. You've got a pair of sixes, and you watch that flop come out ace, six, deuce. It's a fantastic feeling. It's what we play the game for, really. Like, right? I mean, that's a lot of it. That's some of the fun. So, that's what I mean by nutted value. Hands like sets, top two pair, made flushes, made straights. But really, there's a lot of factors that can change what a nutted value hand is or is not in any given situation. For instance, your table image. If you're like the ultimate nit, or you look like, or you appear to be the ultimate nit, or even if you just don't have a bluff raising range on any particular flop, you may need to have a considerably stronger hand before you can be real happy about getting a ton of money on that flop. So nutted value hands are basically going to be hands that when you see the flop, you're kind of thinking, okay, I'm excited, and how do I get all the money in by the river? And I would even say that a good definition of nutted value hands on the flop would be hands that you would be pretty happy to stack off right then and there, or at least willing to get all the money in on the flop, and you're certainly happy to get all the money in if you can do it the right way by the river. So that's a nutted value hand. Top two, bottom set, top set, any set, made flushes, made straights. You get the idea. And it can also depend on stack to pot ratios and stack depth. If you're playing in a heads up 4-bet pot, and you only started out 110 big blinds deep, maybe top pair, top kicker is nutted value because you're happy to get the money in right then and there. And it depends on the board texture too. I mean, definitely a lot more fun to get top pair, top kicker in when there are reasonable, good second best hands that your opponent can have, and when you're not up against multiple opponents. So, your opponent's mistake propensities can change it too. If you're playing against a very nitty, super tight player, or even just a player that does not have a big bluff range on any given flop, and you're playing super deep with this guy, maybe top two pair doesn't look that sexy anymore once you check raise and he jams, right? So a lot goes into what a nutted value hand really is, but basically I'd say a nutted value hand is a hand that you're happy to get all the money in with. So some things to consider when we actually find that 1 in a million opportunity where all of the stars align just so, and we flop our sexy set. We call a pre-flop raise from the button with pocket sixes. The small blind overcalls, and the flop comes out ace, king, six. So now what do? How do we proceed? So first and foremost, your thought process should be simply, how do I get all the money in by the river? That should be, the primary. If you have the smallest stack, so the effective stacks or whatever your stack size is, you just need to be thinking, what's going to give me the best chance of getting all of my money in at some point in this hand? Do we have to bet all three streets, or can we maybe bet flop, check turn back, and then either call or bet the river and get all of the money in? Because those are two different situations. Are we actually going to need to maybe check raise at some point if we're out of position? Are we going to need to make a check raise at some point in order to have a real good chance of getting stacks in? And if that's the case, or if we're in position, are we going to need to raise at some point? And if that's the case, then what street is it going to make the most sense to make our check raise or our raise in position? What street is it going to make the most sense to do that And also, we should consider the potential merit to slow playing. I mean, good players tend to not be real big fans of slow playing, but great players do understand that there is a time to slow play. And we're going to talk about what some of those times to slow play might look like. So the basic considerations are stack depth, the board state, meaning like the kind of wetness or dryness of the board, but really volatile versus static is a better way to look at the board than just wet and dry. And what's the difference? Well, okay, a wet board is typically thought of as a board that has the potential for a lot of draws to be, well, actually, it just really would be probably any coordinated board. If a board's very coordinated, it's got suited connecting cards on it, then it's probably said to be a wet board. And if it's not got anything of the same suit and everything's pretty discombobulated and far apart, then you'd probably refer to that board as being dry. But the idea of volatile and static boards is a little bit different and probably a little bit better thing to think about. A volatile board is just a board where whoever has the best hand right now is not an overwhelming favorite to have the best hand at the river. Or at least that hand values are likely to change considerably between the flop and the river. Versus a static board where, top pair, top kicker is still going to be top pair, top kicker by the river. And, there's not as many draws and things. So basically, a volatile board is going to be a board with lower cards that are connected and or suited. A flop like 9 of spades, 7 of spades, 3 of diamonds is pretty volatile because even if you flop top pair, top kicker on that board, top pair, top kicker on that board, on that flop is not very likely to remain top pair, top kicker by the river, and even on the occasions when it does, it's still not going to have as much value, or it's not going to be objectively as strong, or really I guess you'd say relatively strong by the time bad or really just meaningful turns and rivers come off. A static board is a board where players' ranges are just more likely to be way ahead or way behind. A board like Ace, 7, Deuce, Rainbow would be very static because if you have top pair, top kicker, not only do you likely have the best hand here and now, but you're very unlikely to get outdrawn, and whatever second best hand your opponent might have, it's unlikely for scary cards to come out and change that situation. So that's what I mean by static versus volatile. It's kind of like, wet or dry, but it's a little bit different because we have this other idea of how likely things are to change. That's really what it is. The number of opponents that are in the hand and the ranges that are in play. All of these things go into the line you should take and the thought process you should go into when you flop one of these sort of super powerful nutted value hands. So the more volatile the board is, the more value there is in folding your opponent's equity out. When you have a super strong hand that is not the immortal nuts, and the more opponents you have, the more value there is in just folding out your opponent's equity. But also, on a volatile board, it's likely that you have more incentive to play aggressively with your nutted value hands for another reason, and that is that there's a lot more opportunity for your opponents to have hands that can pay you off in a big way, and that may not be true later on in the hand depending on what cards come off. The ranges in play are always going to be a factor, of course, but the more villains that are in the hand with you, the more your situation starts to resemble a situation where the board state is volatile. And the less players are in against you, the more your situation resembles a static situation. When there's more players, there's more potential for being outdrawn, and there's more ability to get called by second best hands. Same thing with a volatile board. So there's this kind of relationship there. They're similar. Or related would be a better way to put that. Balance. So If you're thinking about check raising a flop, one of the things, like you flop this set, you defend pocket eights from the from the big blind against the button raise, and the flop comes out Jack 8-6 rainbow, or let's say Queen 8-6 rainbow. If you're thinking about going for a check raise on the flop because stacks are deep and you really want to start building a pot now so that you can get a lot of money in by the river, having pot geometry in mind is always a good idea. But you also have to ask yourself, does it even make sense for me to raise here when I don't have a set? Like, am I going to have like very many semi-bluffs? Am I going to have a lot of hands that are? Am I even going to have a bluff range in this exact spot? And if I defend the big blind versus the button and the flop comes something like Queen 8 deuce rainbow, I probably am not even going to have a check raising range in that spot, because if I do check raise Queen 8 deuce rainbow flop, what am I doing that with? Only sets? That's the only thing I ever have. I'm not going to have a ton of two pair combos, obviously. There's not a lot of draws I can have. So if I were going to try to balance my range by throwing in bluffs to balance out my value hands, that's going to be tough, because then I'm going to have to use some pretty abysmal hands, right? I'm going to have to use like 3 to a flush, some naked overcard stuff. I mean, I'm going to have to I'm going to really have to stretch a little bit to find decent hands that have any kind of real equity when they get called in order to create a bluff range. And aside from that, when I check raise my sets and I check raise some abysmal drawing hands, then it's also going to have a negative effect on my check calling range. Like anytime I check call, then I'm just not ever going to have a big hand. So, that's just one question you should ask yourself, is do I need to be balanced? And if you do need to be balanced, really ask yourself, not just, I think everybody thinks of it correctly, or a lot of people think of it correctly when they think about bluffing. They understand sort of intuitively, or they've heard it enough that they need their hand to look like a value hand when they're running a big bluff. But the reverse is also true. When you're trying to get a big stack in, if you're trying to build a big pot and get a lot of money in by making a very aggressive play with a value hand, you want your value hands to be able to look like bluffs or semi-bluffs also. So if you are playing in a situation where you need to have a balanced range, before you go check raising your middle set, ask yourself, what hands do I have that check raise here that are bluffs? Or am I just going to check raise here and my opponent can correctly fold like top pair, top kicker 100% of the time? One thing to look at when you're thinking about whether or not you need to be balanced is, how often does this situation even come up? And are there factors that you can use to kind of camouflage the fact that you have an imbalance here? Like, maybe I'm not playing a lot of hands out of position, and I'm playing this hand out of position, and people are not seeing me play hands out of position. Or maybe the board is very, very coordinated, and I'm in against two opponents, and so I'm playing a multi-way pot out of position on a very wet flop, and that's just not something that's going to happen very often. Then maybe your line might not look so face up as if it were a more standard situation. Or maybe you c-bet the flop with a pair and then you bink a set on the turn. Well, I mean, you're not very often going to bink sets on turns, so for that reason it's not going to really matter that much to be super balanced. But also, like, what other factors could have happened that are not going to happen very often? So sometimes you can go overboard with balance, when I guess a good way to look at it is just to think about it from your opponent's perspective. Like, if you were the opponent watching this hand, would you be able to spot the imbalance? And if you did, would you have a good plan, or would you be able to come up with a good way to really exploit it? Or could this just be like a 1 in a million fluke situation that doesn't really have a good exploitive adjustment to be made? Does the opposition in the hand even pay attention? Because if they're not paying attention, then you really don't need to be balanced. And if they are paying attention, but they are not adjusting, they're not really willing to pull the trigger and go with their reads, then it still might not matter that much. Or maybe they don't even know how to adjust to exploit your imbalances. But even if that's the case, you should pay attention to the other players at the table, because you could be giving away information to players that maybe aren't in this hand with you, but they're watching the hand, and you'll play hands with them in the future. So when to fast play compared to slow play a big monster hand? And usually you're going to want to fast play. Okay, so that's the first thing. But some of the factors that make it more reasonable to slow play a big hand are factors like a static board texture. So you're in a situation where you're unlikely to be outdrawn. There's not a big need to protect your equity, or you don't benefit very much from folding your opponent's equity out. There's just not that many runouts that could either kill your action or actually beat your hand. And it's difficult for your opponents, or it's difficult for opponents to have good second best hands. Maybe you just got the board on total lockdown, and not only is it unlikely for a turn card to come out and kill your action, because it's already probably pretty dead, but you've got no incentive to fold your opponent's equity out. You don't gain anything by that when you've really got it on lockdown, like you flop quads or something. So when you flop quads, it's hard for your opponent to have a second best hand, and you don't have to worry about them outdrawing you. So those are some reasons that you might think about slow playing. Now, if you're in a situation where you do flop quads, you have pocket aces in a 3-bet pot, and you started with pretty small effective stacks to begin with, and maybe you've got a stack to pot ratio of like 1.5 or 2, and the flop is ace, ace, deuce, rainbow. You might just not have much incentive to bet the flop, and maybe a check back could work best, especially if that check back is likely to induce a lot of mistakes from your opponent, whether that mean your opponent is just always betting into space, like anytime you make a non-procedural check, he's just always going to bet, he's going to get very aggro and spazzy, or this opponent is capable of, or likely to call down lighter once you check back in a non-procedural way, like checking back the flop as pre-flop raiser. How much value is there in the deception? Are you going to induce a lot of mistakes by taking the action? If so, then it could be at least one more reason that it could kind of tip the scales in favor of a slow play. The converse of that is also going to be true then. On more volatile textures where it's there's a low card, wet flop, that's going to give you more incentive to play your hand fast. When there's plenty of good second best hands that your opponent or opponents could have, and you have deep stacks, and there really isn't a need for deception, but there might be a lot of good reason to either protect your equity, protect your hand, fold out some stuff, or I should again say or maybe you're trying to play in a balanced way, and you don't really need to protect any other ranges. Like, some of the reason it makes sense to check back a big hand from time to time is if you're a pre-flop raiser and you find yourself checking back, it's part of your strategy to check back when you've got good showdown value, but you have a hand like maybe you 3-bet pocket queens and get called by one player, and the flop comes out like ace, 7, deuce, rainbow. Your opponent checks to you, and you want to check this back and get it closer to showdown, and you want to be able to bluff catch, say, the turn, or start betting for better value. But in any case, you're going to be checking back your showdown value. If you're going to be checking back your showdown value, and your opponent's your opponent or opponents are paying attention, and they know how to exploit that kind of strategy, then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have some big hands in your check back range on occasion to stop your opponent from just bombing or check raising turns and rivers a lot every time you check back as pre-flop raiser. So probably a lot to think about there, but pause it, maybe think this stuff out, or pay attention. You might cover some of the things that I wasn't able to get clear with some examples. So let's say we're out of position. Maybe we're we're in a hijack. Let's see, we have 5-5, and we call the pre-flop open raise hijack versus button. That doesn't make sense. Okay, so sorry, this is just a typo. The out of position part, I guess I decided to change. So we have 5-5, and we are on the button. Hijack opens, we flat. If the flop is ace, 9-5, rainbow, our opponent makes a continuation bet. What's our play? What's our plan here? Does it make sense to just flat call? Does it make sense to raise? And look at 5, 6, 10, two-tone. First, which board do we have more incentive to raise the flop on? And it could just as easily be we're the big blind and the hijack opens and we defend the big blind, and we check on ace 9-5 and our opponent c-bets, or we check on 5, 6, 10 two-tone and our opponent c-bets. If villain c-bets, should we raise the flop, or should we maybe just check and call? Or if he c-bets into us and we are in position, just call and peel and see a turn card. Maybe wait till the turn and raise some turns, raise some rivers. And what would the rationale be? So think about it. Let's say that we are out of position. We are big blind. We flat call pocket fives versus a hijack open. So a guy opens from 2 off the button. And the flop comes up ace 9-5. We check. He makes a 2/3 pot continuation bet. What do? Well, the first thing we need to know to answer the question is how deep are we, right? So if we're not very deep, it might never be a good idea to check raise. But another thing we have to think about is, what's our opponent's range look like? Like, how many legitimate value combos does he have on this board texture? Then we also have to ask, what are his propensities? Is he more likely to continue barreling with his air if we check and call than he is to make bad calls if we check and raise? And if we check and raise now, is he going to fold a lot on future streets? Is he going to peel us once and give up with all of his ace-x's? But he maybe is going to be likely to continue betting those ace-x's. And I think a big one, especially when you're deep stacked, or you're at least 100 big blinds deep in a pot that was open for like 3 times the big blind, heads up. A big one is, does our opponent take pot control lines? It's not something I mentioned earlier in the slide, but it's something that does make a difference. It does matter. If your opponent is the type of player that if he has like an ace-10 on this flop, he's likely to continuation bet the flop and check the turn back, or even if he has a hand as strong as ace-king, is he likely to bet the flop but check the turn back and then either call the river or bet the river if checked to? If he's a player that does take pot controlling lines, that should also shift you more towards check raising the flop. That gives you more incentive to check raise on the flop, because you may not get the opportunity to get 3 streets in any other way. Now, of course, on this 5, 6, 10 two-tone board, no matter what the stack size is, no matter what our opponent's propensities might be, no matter how we expect him to react to our image, like what we expect him to do against our raises based on our image, kind of no matter what the other factors are, we should be more willing or inclined to check raise the 5, 6, 10 two-tone flop by far, because there is value in folding out some of our opponent's range. Sometimes he's got straight flush draws or straight draws or flush draws that, while shouldn't be our main priority to fold out, anything in our opponent's range, really when we flop a nutted value hand, it still does have some value. It's worth something to get rid of hands that are drawing live against us, right? Whereas on the ace-9-5 flop, there just aren't that many hands that are drawing very live against us that don't already have us crushed. So there's less incentive for that reason, and for all of the reasons we've talked about, really, to go for the check raise, and more incentive to check call the flop, check raise the turn. So if all other factors are kind of considered equal, we should be more inclined to check raise on the 5, 6, 10, less inclined to check raise on the ace, 9, 5. And the same is completely true if we're in position. We should be more inclined to raise on the flop on the right, and less inclined to raise on the ace, 9, 5 flop on the left. Okay, so that's one example. Here's a couple more. Let's say we're 200 big blinds deep. We open 9-8 suited in spades from the hijack position, and the cutoff seat calls, and then the button over calls. If the flop comes out 5, 6, queen, all spades, what's our game plan here? Okay, so we're out of position. Both of our opponents are in position. We started 200 big blinds deep, and we go to this flop, and we're pre-flop raiser. What does our line look like? Does it make sense to think about going for a check raise here? Does it make sense to overbet? Does it make sense to make a small bet? What's your thought process here? What are you thinking about? Well, for sure, we're deep, and our opponents are, well, we've got multiple opponents, and they're going to have plenty of hands that have equity against us in their ranges. King, queen with the king of spades is going to have equity. Our hand is very nutted in its value right now, but there's a lot of cards that can come on future streets that can either kill our action or beat us outright. And so all of the things that we've talked about point to the same direction, and that is that we should really be looking to generate a lot of action on the flop. And most of the time, I think that means that we're just going to make a bet. And if we think we're likely to induce aggression by making a small kind of suspect bet size, then you could make that, and you could do that. But with two opponents in on this flop, with that hand, with those stack sizes, and let's say we open 3 times the big blind for simplicity's sake, I think we've just got all the incentive in the world to make a bet for sure, and generally to make a very, a pretty big bet. Like, if we can get away with it and not get exploited, and we don't think our opponent will just always put us on a made flush, maybe our opponents might think more like that we're protecting a top pair, top kicker type hand, or protecting a hand like pocket aces. If we make a big bet, if we're able to make a big bet, then I actually like the big bet. If not, if we really have to worry about balance, then we probably need to make a more standard bet sizing. But in general, on these board textures, when board textures are wet and volatile, I think you can get away with making bigger bets in general, because you're going to have a lot of draws that are going to want to bet, and you're going to have nutted value hands that are going to want to bet, and you're going to have like mediocre hands that will still want to bet. And the mediocre hands could really use some protection. You don't want to give your opponent a really good price to call with, like, king whatever with the king of spades. And when you have a draw, you're going to want to maximize your fold equity. And when you have, like, especially, say, the same flop, but you've got something like the ace of spades with king of clubs, you've got a hand that has the potential to become nutted value. But right now, you've got a lot of incentive to fold out other hands. You don't mind if your opponent folds like any pair. It's a win. It's a win for you when your opponent folds a pair. But you have with a hand like ace of spades X, no pair, just the nut flush draw. Your draws have incentive to bet big, especially when they have potential to become nutted value hands, because just kind of according to basic bet theory, the bigger we make our bet sizes, the more hands we fold out, and the stronger the ranges are that we leave in there just by virtue of folding all the other stuff out, right? And if we have a draw to the nuts, it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and try to fold out everything we can, and it's not such a bad idea, or it works out pretty well, really, that we can do that and leave the strongest parts of our opponent's range in, because those are the hands that are going to have the best chance of giving us action if we do make our hand. So the other situation is we have 100 big blind stacks to start. We open the button with ace ace, and we get called by only the big blind, and the flop comes out ace ace deuce rainbow. We've basically already discussed this. We're not as shallow as in my description before, but kind of the same things apply. I mean, it's just a board you've got completely smashed. It's so hard for your opponent to have a good second best hand. It can make a lot of sense to let them kind of catch up if they have a hand like, king, queen. It's great if we check back and they pick up a king or they hit a queen. Very likely we'll be able to catch a couple of streets of value that way. And if we check back, we might induce bluffs, which is always good when you're sitting there with the nuts. And and we don't have to worry about bad cards coming off and killing our action. Our action's probably already pretty dry. There's not that many good second best hands to call us, and especially not call us multiple streets. So by under-repping our hand, maybe we induce bluffs, maybe we induce lighter call downs, and maybe we give our opponents an opportunity to actually make a hand that's the second best hand that can give us value. Two more, and I'm not going to go through these. I think I've already kind of touched on these more or less. But just two more examples to kind of wrap your head around it. And I think you probably have figured out my approach to kind of determining or deciding how fast we want to play our hands, what street we should be looking to check raise. Is it going to make sense to check and call the flop and look for a check raise on the turn? Or if we're in position, should we raise the flop, should we raise the turn, or should we call flop, call turn, and then look to raise the river? These decisions are always a lot easier to make when you're in position, by the way, because when you're in position with a nutted value hand, you can always assure that either 3 bets go in the pot or your opponent folds. When you're out of position, you don't always have the opportunity to do that, so your opponent can take, his mediocre, strong hands, top pair, weak kicker type stuff, bet flop, check the turn back, and making it impossible for you to set it up so that you either have to get 3 bets into the pot or your opponent has to fold. So when he's got a hand like pocket kings on ace-7 deuce and you've got pocket deuces, it's just going to work out a lot better for you if your pocket deuces are in position, of course. That's always the case, but maybe this is nothing new, and maybe it's not even a situation where it's especially true. But more than that, maybe it's a good illustration of one of the reasons why it's true. That playing in position is just such a monstrous advantage. So in these two spots, queen, 8, deuce. Oh, and by the way, when you're in position deep, you're deep stacked and you're in position with a nutted value hand, that is just so much more valuable than being out of position deep when you've got a nutted value hand, because there's also additional kind of branches of the EV tree in which not only do you get 3 streets of value, but you get 4 bets in, and sometimes 5 bets in, which is just so unlikely to happen when you're playing a nutted value hand out of position, unless you just really cooler somebody hard, or you're playing against a complete idiot, first situation, 100 big blinds deep, you defend the big blind with 8-8, flop is queen, 8, deuce, you check, they bet, you're thinking about going for a raise. I guess just a hint on what I was thinking here is, again, if you're thinking about check raising this flop, what are you check raising this flop with that's not the nuts, right? Are you ever calling with queen 2 or 8-2? So you don't have a very good value rate. You don't have if you check raise your sets on this flop, it just, I think, is going to be too transparent, and it's going to be pretty easy for most of your opponents that are reasonable to figure that you've probably either got a set, that you've probably got a set. Because are you ever check raising this flop as a bluff? And another thing to consider is if you are going to want to check raise your sets on this type of a flop, then maybe you should be looking to take hands like, 10-9 of spades and check raising those as well. So you do have some bluffs. There's more than one way to be balanced, but I think the easiest way to be balanced on a queen 8 deuce flop is when you're out of position is just to not have a check raising range typically on that flop against most players. And then 100 big blinds deep, middle position opens, cut off 3 bets, you 4 bet with pocket kings, so you go 22 times the big blind by the time it gets opened, 3 bet, and you have your pocket kings. Let's say, I think we're in the big blind in this example. I think that was the idea. Yeah. So then middle position calls, but the cutoff folds. So you go heads up to the flop with a small stack to pot ratio, and you completely crush the board. what's your game plan here? And I really think, I know I wasn't going to explain this, and I'm not really explaining it, but I think you could make a pretty good argument, a pretty good case for checking the flop in this situation, and hoping that your opponent takes the bait, and you can maybe check and call. You can still get stacks in by the river. You may even be able, depending on bet sizing, you may even be able to get stacks in by check calling the flop, and even when your opponent checks back on the turn, you can still jam the river and maybe get stacks in against a good percent of your opponent's range that was going to give you action in any other way anyway. So, yeah, not that I'm definitely saying we should just check this flop as pre-flop raiser. It could certainly raise some alarm bells, but you could make a case for it. And I think you should think about these hands and maybe back up and think about the rest of the hands and come up with your own ideas about it, but really just thinking in terms of the some of the conditions and standards that I put out there, I think will help you if you're really just finding yourself not really sure how to proceed when these kind of dream scenarios come up, and you need to really be able to make a lot of money when they do come up. Or I would say if you never make money when you flop a set and no limit hold'em, you're going to have a tough go of it at like in a live cash game environment. A lot of the money comes, in my experience, I guess it's anecdotal, but I think a lot of the money in playing live cash games comes from flopping a set and stacking somebody. But you've got to pay attention to the pot geometry. You've got to pay attention to these basic factors. We have to mostly be inclined to not slow play monster hands to begin with, but understand why we might want to sometimes. Your nutted value hands, that they're mostly there to try to stack your opponent's really strong but not nutted value hands that are in his range. That's what they're really good for. When you think about how your ranges play and how you want to play each part of your range, that's a big thing to think about is, what is this part of my range good at or best at? What should I use it for? And nutted value hands are really good at trying to stack the top of your opponent's range when you get your opponent in kind of a cooler type situation. So, I like to break out the over bets and the kind of crazy pre-flop raising check raises and stuff like that. Watch your balance, of course, when it's necessary, but it's not often, many times it's not as necessary as what you may have been led to believe by a lot of people, in my opinion, would be a good way to put it. Slow plays in game theory optimal scenarios, or according to Nash equilibriums, slow plays are usually not there to trick your opponent so much as they're there to protect other parts of your range. Again, like when you have pocket kings or queens and you 3-bet pre-flop, get called, and the flop comes out like ace 7 deuce. Or you make kind of a light 3-bet with ace 2 suited and get called, and the flop comes out ace XX. If you're going to want to check those hands back, you're going to want to have some slow plays in your range against a knowledgeable opponent, or he can really make life miserable by just either check raising or overbet bombing the turn, and like overbet jamming the river, knowing you can almost never call. And he can do that with a wide value range and a balanced bluffing range as well. Because you've narrowed your range, you've really turned your hand face up, and it's against a good thinking player who knows how to exploit those types of things. You can't cap your range and turn your hand face up when your opponent has enough chips, I guess, to put a lot of pressure on you and knows how to construct a range and has the balls to pull the trigger on it. Pay major attention to the way the hand's going to play out on future streets. Look at the ranges, the potential runouts, what cards can come off, are they good, are they bad, what improvement cards in your opponent's drawing ranges might look like and what they could do for you. Good, bad, or indifferent. And look at the stack sizes, look at the pot sizes. And if you start doing that, I think you're going to do really good at stacking bustas when you flop sets. So until next time, guys, hope that was helpful, hope it was kind of fun and educational and all of that. Until next time, good quote, L-U-C-K, exclamation point, end quote.